What is learning? There are many kinds of learning that we're going to be examining in the AP Psych course, but today's focus is going to be on classical conditioning. But learning in general is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that occurs as a result of experience. So, four factors that form that definition. Learning is inferred from a change in behavior or performance. Results from an inferred change in memory. Learning is a result of experience, and learning is relatively permanent. So that rules out a lot of possibilities of what learning is versus what learning isn't. It also means that behavior changes that are temporary or due to things like drugs, alcohol, etc. are not learned. Now, with one type of learning is classical conditioning, also known as associational learning. And as part of this, whenever we see the word condition, conditioned, or conditioning, that's going to be the same as learning. So it's an equivalency that we have there. So classical conditioning is also known as classical learning. Classical conditioning, a formal definition, that takes place when an originally neutral stimulus comes to produce a conditioned response because of its association with an unconditioned stimulus. Okay, when you first read that, you're like, what? And so over the years, I've created and modified a little graphic that will help you out. But in the meantime, we're looking at Pavlov. And when we've got Pavlov, he's the guy that we're going to be examining when it comes to classical conditioning. He's the one who discovered it in his work with the dogs. Contiguity, not continuity, but contiguity. It's the temporal or the time-based association between two events that occur closely together in time. And so Pavlov discovered that the closely in time two events occurred, the more likely they were to become associated. As time passes, the less likely they are to become associated. Unconditioned stimulus, one part of our puzzle. That means it's an unlearned stimulus. Unconditioned means unlearned. So what can an unconditioned stimulus be? That can be any stimulus that creates an autonomic, automatic, or reflexive response in an organism. That's what distinguishes classical conditioning from operative conditioning. This is something that is going to be autonomic, automatic, and or reflexive. What can unconditioned and unconditioned response be? An unlearned response. Well, that is something that can be elicited or drawn out from an organism. There's going to be an unconditioned response, such as your heart rate increasing, sweating, vomiting or nausea, tears, fear, etc. A conditioned stimulus, a learned stimulus. What can be a learned stimulus? Anything that can be perceived, heard, smelled, whatever. If it can be perceived, it can be a conditioned stimulus. And that means that virtually anything can be paired up with an unconditioned stimulus to become a conditioned stimulus. What about a conditioned response? Anything that can be an unconditioned response can be a conditioned response. In fact, for our purposes in AP Psych, the unconditioned response is always the same as the conditioned response. I know there are going to be some purists who will disagree with this, but for our intra-psych purposes, this is true. So we're not getting into advanced behavioral theory, getting into the basics of classical conditioning. So the diagram that I use has the unconditioned stimulus up here, and the unconditioned response over here. So stimulus, response. It's an unlearned stimulus response association, or stimulus response connection. Then what happens is there is an association made, a pairing that's made with a conditioned response. And so what happens is, and I'm going to clear off these, I'm going to clear off the ink here. What's going to happen is you're going to have your conditioned stimulus right over your and then you're going to have your unconditioned response occur. So it might be heat that it's going to a room rather connected to sweating. So pretty soon you might associate that room with sweating, and then so you sweat just walking into the room, whether or not that
Presentation is to accompany the book Consumer Behavior, a Primer by Gail Tom. How do consumers learn about products? How do they come to form feelings and loyalties to products? Or maybe we should ask, how do marketers teach consumers about products? How do marketers teach consumers to have loyalties to products? In blind taste tests, consumers brand loyal to Coke prefer Pepsi, and the pleasure centers of the brain activate when they drink Pepsi. However, when consumers brand loyal to Coke are asked to taste labeled samples and then choose either Coke or Pepsi, they choose Coke, and the judgment centers of the brain activate. Seemingly, consumer learning about Coke has influenced the taste of Coke. How do consumers learn to prefer the meaning of the brand Coke more than the actual taste? Let's take a look at a couple of Coke commercials from different times.
Whenever there's a pool, there's always a flirt. Whenever there is school, there'll always be homework. Whenever there's a beat, there's always a song. Whenever there's fun, there's always Coca-Cola, yeah. Always Coca-Cola. The stars will always shine, the birds will always sing. As long as there is thirst, there's always the real thing. Coca-Cola Classic is always the one. Whenever there's fun, there's always Coca-Cola, yeah. Coca-Cola, always Coca-Cola.
You were likely entertained while watching this. Perhaps a smile crept across your face, or you found yourself put music. After seeing commercials like these, you likely associate Coke with fun, entertainment, refreshment, friendship, and good times. In addition, your everyday activities include Coke, like having a Coke at a ball game, at a summertime barbecue, or picnic, or at lunch with friends. These were likely positive experiences. Consumers learn to love Coke through repeated association of Coke with things pleasant and fun. This is a type of learning called classical conditioning. It is sometimes referred to as Pavlovian learning after the Russian scientist Ivan Pavlov, who is credited with discovering this type of learning. Let's take a look at a diagram that explains how consumers learned to love the Coke. We begin by acknowledging that consumers are not born into the world knowing what Coke is, or liking it, or disliking it. But consumers are born into the world smiling, happy people, and fun, entertaining events. In classical conditioning, consumers learn to associate Coke with such pleasantness. After a number of such associations, consumers have learned to equate Coke with pleasantness. Let's see how this works. We have Coke, and we are in the company of things that are positive, happy, celebratory, relaxed, upbeat. Make us feel happy and give us a sense of well-being. Coke becomes associated with this positiveness. The consumer's repeated experience of this pairing and association is the process of learning that Coke is a positive product. When consumers see Coke and have pleasant thoughts and feelings, we know that learning has occurred. Consumers have learned what Coke is and have strong, positive, pleasant, and happy feelings to Coke. That was a lot to take in. Let's do this one more time, but in fairness, we will use Pepsi this time. Here is a video clip of Pepsi commercials over the decades.
John B. Watson, known for establishing the behavior school of psychology, carried out most influential psychology studies in the 1920s that would later on be something that would never be forgotten. Classical conditioning, first experimented by Ivan Pavlov, was used on a dog when an unconditional stimulus was used to produce an unconditional response, and a conditioned stimulus was used to produce a conditioned response. This was later on accepted by Watson in his demonstration of the Little Albert experiment. In Watson's experiment, a little baby Albert was used to be conditioned. He was born to a woman who was a nurse in the Harriet Lane Home of Invalid Children. Although raised in a hospital environment, Albert developed normally and was very stable. Ivan Pavlov was indeed able to condition a dog. Could Watson now do the same thing in humans? Now to the actual experiment itself. First off, Watson presented little Albert objects that he was not afraid of. Objects that Albert initially liked. These included fire, a monkey, a dog, a rabbit, finally, a white rat. Albert in particular liked the white rat. From all these clips, note Albert's positive reactions. And now comes the conditioning. To start off the conditioning, when Albert reached to touch the rat, a loud bar was struck whenever Albert reached for the rat. Here, Albert first off fell forward and was startled, but he did not cry yet. But he reached for it for a second time and heard it. He did not cry. Watson had indeed conditioned a fear response in little Albert. Albert was then shown a rabbit. He immediately cried and got as far away as possible from it. Then a dog was all startled. Albert did not cry right away. He was acting cautious, and it was only when the dog came right up to his head that he began to cry and tried to get away from it. After this, a seal fur coat was brought in. Albert turned away from it and was agitated. Then Watson used a Santa Claus mask, which invoked an even more negative response by baby Albert. From the previous experience from the white rat, little Albert suddenly became afraid of familiar objects that had the same characteristics as the white rat. This phenomenon was known as generalization. Watson then wanted to test whether the reaction would carry over in a different setting. The previous tests were done in a small dark room, but now he was brought into a larger room. He was presented with the same objects but did not show strong symptoms of withdrawal until the objects were paired with a loud noise. Watson now wanted to see if fear could remain in Albert over a period of time. Albert was brought home and returned in 1 month. When he returned, he was tested with the same objects and paired with the same places. Albert indeed showed the same strong signs of withdrawal. Watson once again proved that he could condition fear to Albert. Watson concluded that phobias were most likely conditioned responses. The little Albert study is extremely important.
Thorndike was interested in studying animal intelligence. He found that animal intelligence is based on the ability to form connections. That is, when stimulus-response sequences are followed by pleasure, they're stamped in. Those responses, followed by pain, are stamped out. So therefore, he set up some puzzle box experiments to investigate the notion of instructional conditioning. So Thorndike coined the notion of trial and error learning. That is, animals learn by trial and error or reward and punishment. Specifically, trial and error learning refers to an organism's to learn or solve a problem by trying alternative possibilities until the correct solution is achieved. So the elements of trial and error include: we must have a number of attempts, trials, and a number of errors before the correct behaviour is learnt. The learner must be motivated to keep striving towards their goal, and they must be able to maintain exploration, i.e. the ability to either come up with random or purposeful alternatives. There must be reward at the end of the process. Thus, this will lead to repeat performance of the correct response, strengthening the association between the behaviour and the outcome. And once this association has been formed, the learnt behaviour will be performed more quickly and with fewer errors in the future. So in terms of the puzzle box experiment, Thorndike put a hungry cat in the puzzle box with some fish within view, but just out of reach. So initially, the cat's behaviour was fairly random, i.e. tried to stick its paw through.
Can pigeons read? This one gives every indication, because he's been taught to distinguish between two words and to behave appropriately. He's learned his different response to each sign by being rewarded with food. So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behaviour is shaped by controlling its environment. The first task was to isolate an individual piece of behaviour and see how that could be changed. Skinner did this by keeping individual pigeons at about 3/4 of their normal weight, so that the birds were always hungry, and food could be used as an automatic reward. The pigeon was studied in a uniform box, one it quickly grew used to. One piece of behaviour, pecking a coloured disc, was measured on a graph. The pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward. Then the behaviour of pecking could be studied in relation to how often that reward was offered, or in Skinner's terms, of reinforcement.
The main thing is what we call schedules of reinforcement. Reinforcement is what the layman calls reward, and you can schedule it so that a reward occurs every now and then when a pigeon does something. We usually use a response with a pigeon pecking a little disc, a little spot on the wall, and you can reinforce with food. But you don't reinforce every time. Perhaps every 10th time, or perhaps only once every minute or something like that. There are a very large number of schedules, and they have their special effects. And they're a good example of how you can move from...
While some scientists engineer shiny new consumer goods for an eager public, Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner seeks nothing less than the engineering of human nature. In experiments with subjects as simple as pigeons, Skinner declares that with the right social engineering, we can create a new breed of human being. Skinner is firmly in the behaviorist tradition pioneered by John Watson in the 1920s. Like Watson, Skinner contends with the right tools, we can predict and control behavior.
Skinner really inherited the from Watson of behaviorism in this country, but it's kind of interesting to think about how there's a subtle difference in the way they went about it. Watson, as we know, ended up becoming an advertising executive, ended up embracing the American value system, as it existed. Skinner was different. Skinner was a visionary. Skinner felt that through behaviorism, he could influence the world towards a greater humanity, not meet humanity where it was, but take humanity to a new place through the principles of behaviorism.
Picking up where Watson left off, Skinner wants to do the rigorous science to prove that environment is everything. Change the environment, he argues, and you can change the individual. Or in Skinner's case, the pigeon.
Skinner himself was a known gadgeteer. He had, in his own early years, as a boy, for example, he developed ways of sorting ripe, I think it was cranberries, from unripe cranberries. He invented a cannon that would shoot things over his neighbor's fence. This was the kind of man he was. He was developing new ways to do everyday things in ways that were more comfortable, more efficient.
During World War II, Skinner had developed a pigeon guidance device for the U.S. military. While the Russians had dogs carrying bombs, and the Swedes had seals to blow up mines, Skinner had a plan of his own. Teaching pigeons to guide missiles to an enemy target.
Do answers suddenly come to you in a burst of clarity? Or do you learn by watching others? Most people experience both. One common form of learning involves observing and mimicking others. This social modeling is called observational learning. Stanford psychologist Albert Bandura conducted a social experiment that illustrated how aggressive behavior can be learned by watching violence on TV and in real life. First, a group of children watched an adult hit, kick, and sit on an inflatable boxing toy in the shape of a clown, called a Bobo doll. Next, the kids were allowed to play with toys for a short period, after which the toys were taken away in order to build a feeling of frustration. Then the children were allowed to play with the Bobo doll. Not surprisingly, the majority of kids imitated the adult's behavior, hitting the Bobo doll, even using toys provided. While this experiment may seem strange and even a little cruel, there's an important lesson to be learned. We take our cues for appropriate behavior from our parents, brothers, sisters, teachers, friends, and other role models. Monkey see, monkey do. Now think about a time when you were puzzling over a problem and all at once...
The following KQED production was produced in high definition.
Artificial intelligence. The phrase may send a shiver down your spine, suggesting images of Terminator robots bent on world domination.
Listen to me very carefully.
But today's intelligent robots, advanced as they might be, are more like toddlers than Terminators, trying to grasp the world around them.
That wasn't great. So it turns out that robots to recognize things from a picture is one of the most difficult things for robots to do. So we often end up writing fairly large amounts of software to, say, recognize what a computer mouse is or what some other object is.
To cope with complex tasks like object recognition, top AI researchers like Stanford University's Andrew Ng wrestle with problems in computer science, cognitive psychology, math, and even philosophy when trying to demonstrate intelligence in a robot.
When you think about human intelligence, I think people can do a lot of things, and when robots start doing some of the things that we think of as requiring cognition or reasoning or thought, that's when we think of our robots as starting to be intelligent as well. For example, if you have a robot recognize a new object it's never seen before, or if you have a robot able to navigate a building that it wasn't explicitly programmed to navigate, these are examples of what we think of as artificial intelligence.
Building a robot that can recognize new objects and size up environments. It's all in a day's work for STARE, the Stanford Artificial Intelligence robot.
On the STARE project, our goal is within a decade to develop the technology to make it useful to put a robot in every home. Many of us spend household chores like tidying up and cleaning and cooking. And on the STARE project, I'd like to build a robot that can do many of these things for you.
Before STARE, there was Shaky, the first artificial intelligence robot, created in 1966 at the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park. Since Shaky, computers have gotten far more nimble. Why hasn't AI made gains? Well, with AI, the intelligence lies less in the hardware and more in the software. And writing the code, or algorithms, to make machines smarter has been tricky.
Algorithms really lie at the heart of making the robot smart enough to carry out all the tasks we want it to do. To implement these algorithms often requires that the programmers have a deep understanding both of computer science principles as well as of robotics principles, how to move things around and what different sensor readings are telling you about what's out there in the world.
And looking at the world through STARE's eyes offers a new perspective, or more accurately, a whole new dimension.
When you're building a robot, you can often endow it with extra sensors that we as people don't have. One of the extra sensors we have on a robot is a laser scanner. And what it does is when it's trying to figure out the three-dimensional shape of something in front of it, it plays a laser over what's in front of it. And by seeing where the laser beam falls and doing some math, it can actually compute the 3D position of a lot of points in front of the robot.
But seeing the objects around it is only part of the challenge. STARE then has to be able to recognize them if it's going to interact with them.
So the way the robot learns to recognize objects is we actually show it lots of examples of, say, bicycles or coffee mugs or slippers or whatever. What a computer actually sees is a lot of numbers like these, and it tells you for every pixel in that picture exactly how dark or gray it is. And so a small number is a light pixel, and a big number is a dark pixel. And the job of a robot is to look at a lot of numbers like these and figure out if there is a sleeper in those numbers.
And when it comes to learning, it turns out that even machines can respond to a little positive reinforcement. Here, numbers function as rewards.
So one way of thinking about this is that it distills down the notion of rewards down to a mathematical form.
The complexity of memory could now be dissected into its component processes. First, input must be encoded, put into memory codes that can be registered by the brain. It must be stored and retained for some period of time, ranging from a moment to a lifetime. And finally, it must be retrieved on demand when it's needed. There are also two kinds of memory. Long-term memory is the storehouse of everything you know about the world and yourself. It's essentially unlimited. In theory, anything you have experienced which is stored in long-term memory is available for later recall. To understand the process of retrieval, try picturing your long-term memory as your own private library. But instead of information stored in books, some researchers believe it is stored and represented in the form of networks. In these associated networks, each piece of information or concept is linked to a family of others that share some common properties. Activating any concepts in the network activates the others associated with them. This activation process spreads automatically and rapidly, not only within networks, but also across to others that are linked in any way meaningful to the individual. In order for me to become consciously aware of the outcome of this activation process, in order for me to identify and understand what's going on around me, something more than long-term memory is needed. That's because long-term memory is like a passive storehouse of information and not an active information dispatcher. So we need a memory system. We need a